So hi, as Hansel mentioned, I'm Ricardo Mendez, and we're going to be talking about privacy here. Actually, I'm the technical director for Europe at Samsung Next in Berlin, where we partner with and invest in forward-looking deep tech companies and innovators. Now, we're going to be talking about privacy, so I'm not going to go into the whole venture capital thing, but if you're working to something cool and you want to talk about it, feel free to grab me right after. Speaking of which, I noticed this thing on the registration desk, and that's, kudos to the organizer. This is pretty cool. We really need more conferences taking people's desire for privacy into account, even if just a few of the attendees end up using it. Now, we're here to talk about privacy, so I'm curious, have you ever tried to ask the average people out there, what do they know about decentralized platforms in general? And I'm not even talking about decentralization at large, or even just average users on the street. I mean, I'm talking even tech people, say, just asking a tech person who's not in the space, what do they know about even ledgers, say Bitcoin versus Ethereum? And turns out that most of them have no idea. Like, some of them might know, if they're in tech, that Ethereum has a Turing-complete virtual machine. Maybe they've heard about smart contracts, but that's pretty much it. And people do know a few things, though. So show of hands. Let's make this a little bit interactive. Let me know if you have heard one of this before. The crypto comes from all the data out there being encrypted. Anyone heard this? Then how about blockchains are private because they are decentralized? And this makes them anonymous and completely untraceable. And yeah, these are misconceptions, and yes, users should know what a tool is for before they use it, but I think that this is partly our fault. We talk a lot to users about, giving them back their privacy and putting them in control of their data, but we don't really tell them what this means. And then they go online and they read some misconceptions on some article, and this all conflates together to make these things look like some great protean tool that can do anything that they want and with no trade-offs whatsoever on top of it. And something that we need to keep in mind is that for most people, we are dealing with a lot of new concepts. I mean, we're talking about ledgers, and we're talking about consensus and governance models, and what the hell is a snark even? For somebody who's coming in from just a regular centralized model or banking, these are new things that they need to start absorbing. So even, I'm on the space and actively working on this, and a good chunk of the time that went into this talk was into figuring out that, if everything that I had in my mind was still current. For instance, it was encouraging to see that Vitalik Buterin is changing his stance on privacy, and he wrote on a Reddit thread that he saw privacy as a way to prevent signaling concerns from encompassing all of our activity. And, well, he's not wrong. But the thing is, I suspect that the signaling he has in mind is very much a first world problem, because everything we do in public generates signals, whether we like it or not. However, for us here in the first world, the signaling concerns are basically just a social mechanics issue. They're going to be something that we need to keep in mind or work around or completely ignore. Worst case scenario, we're going to have to fend off an internet mob or two, but that's pretty much it. However, periodically you hear somebody describe what they're doing as we're putting X, whatever X is, on the blockchain. Which is nice, but the thing is, this misses the point that blockchains are effectively logs, and logs have a use, but it's not something that you necessarily want to use for every case. And all too often, they consider that this often very personal data that they plan to put on the blockchain is safe because it's going to be encrypted with a key that only the user has. So let's talk a bit about this usage assumption, the key safety. And again, early morning, so let's try to get everybody involved here. Raise your hand if you believe in being in control of your private keys. Okay, figures. Now, who expects that public key cryptography is going to keep our data safe from attackers, at least until somebody figures out the quantum computing issue? Okay. Now, who here has ever had a gun to their heads? Yeah. That last one, that's where signaling concerns me, actually. In a lot of places, sending the wrong signal can very easily get you in trouble or quickly become an issue of life and death. And something that one hears regularly about the justification of what we do, of why we do what we do, is because it's making the world a better place. It's going to improve people's lives. And I think that to really make the world a better place for the majority of people, pseudonymity is not enough. I mean, it's nice, it has a use, but pseudonymity has the problem that it only needs to be broken once. And if you're only pseudonymous, then you're trusting the operational security of every individual and system that you actually interact with. And in the places that could really use help, that could really use a leg up the most, having pseudonymity broken could have serious implications for them. I mean, suppose that you live in a safe and stable country like Germany, and for some reason, somebody breaks your pseudonymity and you get outed as a crypto millionaire. What's the worst that's going to happen? I mean, you get put in the wrong tax bracket, maybe. Your neighbor figures out that you have all this crypto and considers you one of the bourgeois. You know, these are things that we can deal with. But if these are our main concerns, then censorship resistance, the lack of reliance on outside institutions, the pseudonymity, they start sliding away slowly from being requirements and more into really nice to haves. Those who could benefit from these tools, from these extremely empowering tools the most, I think, are those people who are the most vulnerable. And I think that for those people, we actually need to move closer to privacy and anonymity. Because something that those of us with libertarian tendencies tend to think of is of the rogue state. You know, we tend to see the attacker as this oppressive regime coming from people. And sure, that happens. I mean, it's happened recently even. We've had situations where people's equipment is confiscated because state agents figured out that they had it, and they figured out that they had it because of metadata, power consumption. Now, in this scenario, when I discuss it with people, a lot of them say, well, you know, they're going to get my equipment, but since I have my keys, then they don't get my crypto or my data. Which, at first blush, sounds about right. But if you really think that, well, you probably didn't raise your hand when I asked if you had ever had a gun to your head. Who here has heard of Robert Hook's cryptanalysis? Nope. Okay, then Robert Hook's cryptanalysis is an easy, cheap, and effective to break pretty much any ciphertext. And it's almost always effective. It only has 2 steps. The first step is that you find somebody who knows the password. And the second is that you beat them with a rubber hose until they give it to you. That's it. And in the majority of cases, this is the type of attack that we should be worried about. You know, we're not talking about a massive government coming in to take your crypto. We're talking about criminals like this going after your users when they figure out that they have something and beating them until they give it to them. So we need to make it harder for this type of criminal to find their victims. We need to make it easier for people to be private in general. Because here in the first world, these efforts that we're doing are definitely making our world a better place. You know, but we need to be realistic. We need to keep in mind that we are in a rather select group. We speak multiple languages, we're technologically literate, we can afford to take a few days off to just attend the conference and listen to random strangers talk about a rather obscure topic. But, you know, if we lose sight of the fact that we are effectively very privileged, and if we just conform to if you're just happy to have this, then we don't really get to talk about making the world a better place for the majority. And look, I'm not going to be a hypocrite here. I happen to be in this very privileged demographic right now. If these things that we're building make our world a better place, we'll take it. But we're going to be leaving behind a whole bunch of people around the world who could really use help. Now, the question then is, how can we help them? And I think that the key thing here is looking at having more private defaults for users. Because yes, users can change the defaults. If the average user figures out there's a setting and researches it and tweaks it and is not afraid to lose their data when they change this thing. There was this article from The Guardian a few years ago which collected several studies of how often people actually do this. And I'm going to spoil it for you, actually. It didn't matter if it was about changing the defaults maps application or just configuring Word, like Microsoft Word a little bit. 95% of users never changed a single default on their system. If your defaults aren't private, they're going to stay non-private. Next thing that we can keep in mind is, can we help with the metadata? You know, can we transfer things? We are running an application that has network access. Can we transfer things in a peer-to-peer manner instead of just sending it to the net at large? Can we, if we talk about the case of proof of power consumption that I mentioned earlier, for instance, in a place, keep in mind how other places operate. In a place like Germany, power consumption, for your power consumption to out in the amount of equipment you have in your house, basically the power company and the government will need to collude against you, which is fairly rare. However, in most places out there that I've visited, power consumption is easily available. It's still manually collected. So basically there's a power meter facing the street for anybody to walk out and take notes if they want. Now, maybe we can completely remove the metadata, but if so, can we give users a plausible deniability aspect? For instance, the hidden volumes that VeraCrypt supports and TrueCrypt before. In this scenario, if a kidnapper or robber attacks one of your users, then they get to enter a particular password which shows the attacker a fake, almost empty wallet instead of giving them access to the entire system. And this is probably going to satisfy the attacker. But mostly, we need to start speaking plainly to users, because all too often, we just seem to want to talk about the features that we have and not the trade-offs in our systems. And we need to help them build a mental model of what we're doing, because once they build a mental model, they're very unlikely to change it. Because we're really close to this thing hitting the mainstream. And I know how most of this is coming across, right? I mean, I am coming from an age where, you know, if you were lucky enough to have a computer, everything was stored locally on your floppies, and all we had to do was cache. All we had to use was cache, was the only option. But it feels like we're at the cusp of something here. It feels to me like any day now, someone is going to figure out enough usability issues, and decentralization is going to pour into the mainstream. Once it does, users will start pouring in and will start poking around and tinkering with what you have given them. Most of them will keep going with the first system that they get used to. And then 95% of them are not going to change the defaults. So we need to make sure that those defaults are as private as we can make them. And when designing something, keep in mind that the major threat, once this becomes mainstream for the majority of your users, it's not going to be this, guys. It's going to be this. Thank you.